What's going on, guys? My name is Steve. Thank you for stopping by my channel. Today we're going to be reacting to why Britain advanced before other European nations. In other words, why Britain became so powerful. I think most people understand that the British Empire is one of the most powerful empires in all of history. Some people would probably say the Roman Empire was the most powerful. Others would say it was the Persian Empire. But I think most people would agree with me and say it's actually the British Empire that was the most powerful empire in history, for the simple reason that the British Empire has the most influence of any empire in history on our modern world. Just think of everything that came out of the British Empire that has affected our modern world. Things like the English language, countries like the US came out of the British Empire. All sorts of technological advancements came out of the British Empire. Things like the way we set our laws in a lot of countries. For example, the way we have our Senate and our Constitution, those things came out of the British Empire in one way or another. I mean, so much of today's modern world, when you really look back at it, comes out of the British Empire in one way or another. And it's just amazing that this small island nation was able to take its beliefs, take its people, and just go all over the world and basically colonize the entire world. And a lot of people would say some of the things they did were bad. No doubt. Every country's done bad things. But just think of what the modern world would be like if the British Empire had never existed. If the British Empire did not become as powerful as they were and were able to go out and spread all over the world. A lot of the wonderful things that we have in a lot of countries today wouldn't exist. And obviously, the biggest for me is the fact that the U.S., in the way it is today, probably wouldn't exist. Us having our Constitution and the way things are set up here, the freedoms we have in a lot of countries, not just the U.S., but a lot of the freedoms that we take for granted in all sorts of our first world Western countries actually, got their origination from ideas out of the British Empire. So anyways, guys, I came across this video and I was like, that'd be really interesting to learn about. So I don't really know what to expect here, but I'm very curious on why Britain advanced before other European nations. Because if Britain hadn't advanced before other European nations, surely maybe it would have been another European nations that would have somewhat took the reins and went and, spread more of their ideals around the world. And who knows what the world would look like. I'm not saying it would be better or worse. I'm just saying that it would definitely be different. So anyways, guys, enough of me rambling. Let's go ahead and dive in and learn why Britain became so powerful.
Patterns of conquest have not been determined solely by technology or even by culture in general. Geography, including disease environments, has played a major role in the history of conquest, as it has in the history of cultural evolution in general. The steppes of Central Asia and the plains of Eastern Europe have been far better settings for cavalry charges than the mountainous terrain of the Balkans or the heavily forested parts of Central Europe, while island nations such as Britain and Japan have of course been wholly immune. China tried to create the effects of natural barriers with its Great Wall, as Hadrian's Wall in Britain and the Maginot Line in pre-war France attempted the same thing on a smaller scale.
Hadrian's Wall. I've got to look that up. I've heard about that, but I have no idea what it is.
Geographic barriers have spared some peoples from conquest or delayed its coming. Mountainous terrain has permitted independence to persist in some places long after the adjoining lowlands have been overrun by invaders. Morocco, Ceylon, Abyssinia, Scotland, and Tibet are just some of the places in which this has been so. However, geographical barriers have been a mixed blessing, as technological and cultural backwardness have likewise been the fates of many of these isolated regions. Moreover, the relative poverty of such regions has also been one of the deterrents to conquest, along with the fighting abilities of mountain men, for there was little or no profit to be had from the conquest of many such areas. Differential resistance to one another's diseases, which played a key role in the conquest of the Western Hemisphere, retarded the conquest of Africa until much later in history, because it was the indigenous peoples who succumbed to new, mixed disease environments in the Americas, while it was the Europeans who were fatally vulnerable to the diseases of tropical Africa
That
until
makes sense.
quinine and other modern medical and public health measures
Definitely makes
made
sense.
it possible for them to survive amid the tropical diseases that flourished south of the Sahara. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans long protected the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere from the conquerors of the rest of the world, and, even as late as the first half of the 20th century, these oceans made isolationism a viable option for the United States, as it was not for most of the nations of Europe or Asia. However, smaller bodies of water may facilitate rather than impede military attacks, for huge differences between the high cost of land transport and the low cost of water transport can be as important militarily as it has been economically. During the Crimean War, for example, the British and the French attacking forces were supplied by water, while the Russian defenders at Sevastopol had to be supplied by land, since the waters were controlled by British and French warships. Even with approximately 125,000 peasant carts requisitioned to supply the defenders from their own adjacent homeland, their limited supplies of ammunition did not permit them to reply in kind to the barrages fired at them from the sea. Nor was this simply a matter of conditions favoring attackers or defenders in general. Both in Spain and in Russia, Napoleon's attacking armies met disaster when they had to be supplied over land, while the opposing armies were supplied across water. The inaccessibility of African rivers to ocean-going warships made this continent less vulnerable to European naval power than much of the Western Hemisphere was. The Dutch, for example, could send ocean-going vessels more than 100 miles up the Hudson River to establish an outpost at what would later become the city of Albany. No river in Africa was that accessible, whether due to insufficient water levels or, more commonly, sandbars, cascades, and waterfalls. The shallow coastal waters in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa meant that large European warships could often not get close enough to the shore in many places, necessitating the loading of European troops into smaller boats, which could in many places be effectively opposed by Africans in similar-sized boats, particularly in the early centuries before European firearms had developed the accuracy and speed of firing that they would have in later eras. The history of the British people, like the history of other peoples around the world, illustrates the enormous importance of human capital, whether in the form of specific skills, general education, or traditions and laws that facilitate both economic development and the development of free institutions. The many centuries that it took for the British to rise from cultural and economic backwardness to the forefront of world civilization in technology and political dominance suggests something of the difficulty of acquiring the necessary human capital. The vital role played in this process by numerous other peoples who came to the British Isles, whether as conquerors, immigrants, or refugees, also suggests how important cultural diffusion is. The Romans, the Normans, the Jews, the Lombards, and the Huguenots all contributed in important ways at different historical junctures to what would ultimately become a British achievement. The geography of the British Isles also played an important role, not in determining what people would do, but in determining the boundaries of what was possible. The simple fact that Britain is an island nation, and that water transport is vastly cheaper than land transport, and was especially so in the era before railroads, meant that the British could transport heavy raw materials like coal to different parts of the United Kingdom much more cheaply and rapidly than was possible within nations with large interiors such as Germany or the United States, both of which had to wait for the era of railroads to challenge the British in industrialization. The fact that the key raw materials of the industrial age, iron ore and coal, were located very near each other and also near navigable waterways in Britain, again gave the British decisive early advantages over countries like Germany and the United States, as well as permanent advantages over regions of the world where such natural resources do not exist at all and cannot be imported at any feasible economic cost. Significantly, Japan, one of the few countries that was later able to rise to the industrial forefront without such natural resources, is an island like Britain, and no part of Japan is more than 70 miles from the sea, so imported raw materials could be brought in economically, as would be.
Is that true? I remember someone saying that, and I think it may be true that it's roughly about that with on the UK, in the UK as well, that there's nowhere that's no more than about 70 miles from the sea. I believe that 70 miles is what I heard, which is interesting that that's the same as for Japan, if that's accurate.
Be virtually impossible in the Balkans or in much of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, due to more formidable geographical barriers in these places. Geographical advantages and cultural imports have permitted more to be accomplished within the British Isles than in many other parts of the world, but ultimately it was the British themselves who had to accomplish it.
Right.
That they
Yeah.
did so has had enormous consequences, not only for the inhabitants of the United Kingdom or even for past and present members of the British Empire or Commonwealths, but for the entire world. The highly varying degrees to which different segments of the British population acquired the necessary human capital demonstrates that the opportunity alone is not sufficient for economic or other accomplishments. Nor was it simply a matter of what the existing society permitted to different groups, for those same groups showed similar economic and social patterns when transplanted to other societies in North America or in Australia and New Zealand. British law and its traditions of impartiality made London a magnet for the capital of the world, enabling Britain to industrialize with other people's capital as well as its own. In a later era, the British colony of Hong Kong would similarly attract capital from around the world by the dependability and impartiality of its laws, while many poverty-stricken countries were unable to obtain much-needed capital because of their undependable laws and confiscatory policies toward foreign investors. British law was of course more than an economic asset. Its separation of powers and rights of citizens against the government were the foundation of the freedom of the British themselves. The revolutions of the 17th century, including the beheading of King Charles I in 1649 and the uprisings in 1688 that led James II to flee to France, made the separation of powers even more dramatically vindicated and an indelible part of the British Constitution. While many other countries copied British systems of law and government, those that succeeded in creating similarly free governments were largely those that came from the same tradition: the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, for the historical experiences that were distilled into powerful traditions were essential to the functioning of the legal and political institutions themselves. While these institutions could be copied by anyone, the history and traditions behind them could not be synthesized, and it was these intangibles that made the tangible institutions and structures work.
Wow. Okay. That was a lot of information in such a short video. But basically, in a nutshell, it's basically the reason Britain became so powerful and the British Empire, Britain advanced before other European nation was a combination of its laws, which separated the powers, the geography, and the fact that it was a small island nation. So a lot of its raw materials were close to each other. And then you had an easy transportation all around the UK based off of not only waterways inside throughout the UK, but also the fact that you're an island nation, you can just go along down the coast and go from one area to the other relatively easy for train and whatnot. And obviously, I guess that's where the canals came in. They just took those, waterways that you industrialized so early. And you had these lot of rivers, I guess, and whatnot. And you were like, this is a good way to get raw materials from point A to point B. And so you created all these canals that basically become an even larger man-made river system, if you will. And then the other thing, it sounds like, is because so many people conquered or tried to conquer this set of islands here, right? This island. that you got ideas and technology and, people from all sorts of different areas, right? And so when you're isolated, like most of the world in some way was for a very long time, if you were in the center of what we now know as in America, there was no new thoughts, there was no new ideas coming in, right? It was all what they already knew, and there was nothing new, no new ideas, coming into the land, so to speak. But that was different for Britain is, right? I mean, there were so many different people coming in and bringing their traditions with them, and all that kind of merged over time to help people learn faster, and just kind of things just developed from there at a quicker manner than if it was just one group of people, knowing what they knew. I guess that's kind of what, it's kind of hard to explain what he said, but yeah. Anyways, guys, I thought this was interesting. I'd appreciate it if you have anything to add. Please feel free to add it in the comments. I'd like to hear whatever you had to add to this, and what your thoughts about this video are. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for stopping by. Please click that like button. Feel free to drop your comments or suggestions about this video or others, and don't forget to subscribe to continue to follow me on my journey to discover my British and Irish ancestry. Until next time, guys, peace.